The night was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Captain Marcus Harris, the black police captain of the city's busiest precinct, knew this silence well. He had been through too many tense moments to count, but tonight felt different. The cool wind whipped through his roll-down window as his black SUV cruised through the deserted streets. He had just finished his shift and was heading home, exhausted but alert. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him to be cautious. Suddenly, the flash of blue and red lights pierced the quiet night, accompanied by the wail of a siren. Marcus's hand automatically gripped the wheel tighter as he glanced in his rearview mirror. The flashing lights blinked back at him, casting strange, ghostly shadows inside the car. His brow furrowed. It wasn't uncommon for cops to pull people over, but something about this felt off. With a steady hand, Marcus guided the SUV to the side of the road. He didn't hesitate, just slid his vehicle to a stop, the tires grinding against the pavement. His eyes scanned the rearview mirror again, his heart rate slightly increasing. The officer's car parked behind him, its engine still running, lights flashing. As the minutes passed, Marcus's senses sharpened. The city was still, the occasional sound of a distant car passing by the only indication that he wasn't entirely alone. He knew he had done nothing wrong. His registration was up to date, and his driving was as clean as always. But this wasn't about that. This wasn't just about a routine traffic stop. The officer approached the SUV slowly, his boots echoing against the concrete. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had seen it all before. He had faced down drug dealers, armed robbers, and even dangerous suspects on the run. He had earned his place as the captain of the precinct through grit, determination, and hard work. But this felt different. There was something unsettling about the way the officer moved. His posture was rigid, and his hands were hovering near his weapon, not resting casually at his side. Marcus lowered the window, his eyes scanning the officer as he stepped into the dim glow of the streetlight. He could see the young cop's face, pale, almost nervous. He couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy. His uniform was crisp, but his body language betrayed a lack of experience. "Evening, sir," the officer said, his voice tight and clipped. "License and registration." Marcus raised an eyebrow. His voice, calm and commanding, matched his cool demeanor. "Evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's eyes flicked over Marcus, quickly scanning him from head to toe. Marcus felt a strange unease in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way the officer hesitated before speaking again, or perhaps it was the strange, calculating look in his eyes. Marcus didn't know it yet, but what was about to unfold would alter the course of his life forever. "Everything okay, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but now laced with an undercurrent of tension. He didn't like the feeling creeping up on him, but he couldn't shake it. "License and registration, sir," the officer repeated, his hand still hovering near his holster, eyes locked on Marcus. The officer's words weren't as much of a request as a demand, and that's when Marcus noticed it. The officer wasn't just asking for his credentials. He was sizing him up, judging him. Marcus had seen this before. But not like this. Not with this level of hostility. "Why are you pulling me over, officer?" Marcus asked, leaning slightly forward. He wasn't going to just hand over his license without understanding why he had been stopped. The officer hesitated for a moment, then lowered his hand from the holster, but the tension didn't lift. Instead, it seemed to grow heavier in the air between them. The officer's eyes flicked around nervously, and that's when Marcus saw it. A flash of something darker in his eyes. Fear. Or was it hate? "I've been seeing you around here for weeks," the officer finally said, his voice just a little too loud. "I don't know why you're always in this area, but you don't belong here." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. He wasn't imagining it now. There was something else going on here, something far beyond a simple traffic stop. This officer wasn't just pulling him over, he was accusing him. This wasn't about driving, this was personal. "What did you just say?" Marcus asked, his tone turning from calm to sharp, his gut instincts kicking in. The officer's gaze hardened as he took a step closer to the SUV. "You heard me. You're a black man in a neighborhood like this. You don't fit in here. You shouldn't be driving around this area. You're not welcome." The words hit Marcus like a slap across the face. He blinked, trying to process what was happening. A flash of disbelief flickered in his chest. He had been a cop for over 20 years. He had worked side by side with people of all races, all backgrounds, and he had never been faced with such direct racial hostility from another officer, let alone in his own city. He wasn't just being pulled over for a traffic violation. He wasn't just being accused of something that wasn't his fault. He was being targeted. And worse, he was being targeted by someone who should have known better. A fellow officer. Marcus's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This wasn't right. It wasn't just wrong, it was a violation of everything he had worked for in his career. His voice, low but firm, carried the weight of authority. "I'm the captain of this precinct. You have no right to speak to me like this." The officer blinked, momentarily stunned. For the briefest moment, Marcus thought the officer might back down, might apologize. Or even pretend it never happened. But the young man's expression shifted from shock to defiance in an instant. "I don't care who you are," the officer spat, his voice suddenly cold and hostile. "You're nothing more than a black man in the wrong place. And I don't think you belong here." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The words, the venom in the officer's voice, were like a punch to the gut. He had heard whispers about bias in the force. He had heard about officers crossing lines in ways that were unethical, even dangerous. But he had never imagined it would happen to him, especially not like this. "Give me your badge number," Marcus demanded, his voice now steely with resolve. "We're going to report this." The officer's eyes flicked to the side, and Marcus noticed the slight twitch of his hand. Was the officer nervous? Was he second-guessing himself? Or was he just trying to figure out how to escalate the situation further? The officer hesitated for a moment longer than Marcus expected. Then, before he could respond, something happened. Something strange. A soft voice, almost like a whisper, seemed to float through the air. It wasn't coming from Marcus's car. It wasn't coming from the officer. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere close enough that it should have been impossible to ignore. "Don't do it." Marcus froze. His hand was still gripping the door handle, ready to pull it open. His eyes darted to the officer. The young man's face had gone pale, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the holster on his gun. He was no longer looking at Marcus. He was looking around, his head turning frantically as though searching for something, or someone. "What did you say?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer didn't respond at first. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes wide with a growing sense of fear. His whole demeanor had changed in an instant. He no longer looked like a cocky, judgmental officer. He looked like a man who had just been confronted by something he couldn't explain. "I didn't say anything," the officer muttered, his voice shaky. But his eyes were no longer locked on Marcus. They were darting to the trees along the roadside, to the shadows that stretched across the pavement, as though he was searching for something, or someone. Marcus's mind raced. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He had dealt with confrontations before, but never like this. Never with this much fear and tension hanging in the air. Something strange was happening, and it wasn't just the officer. It was something much bigger, something deeper. Something that was starting to unravel before his very eyes. Marcus opened his mouth to ask again, but before he could speak, a distant sound, almost like a muffled shout, echoed in the distance. The officer's face went even paler. "We need to leave," the officer whispered, more to himself than to Marcus. But Marcus wasn't about to let this go. Not now. Not like this. He was about to demand answers when the sound came again, a voice. Clearer this time, unmistakable. "Don't trust him." The officer's pale face and trembling hands haunted Marcus as he drove away from the scene. The unease he felt moments before had shifted into something deeper, something darker. His mind was racing, replaying the strange encounter over and over. What was that voice? Where had it come from? Was it in his head, or had he actually heard it? And why had the officer been so afraid? Marcus knew he couldn't let this go. He had to understand what had just happened. He had been pulled over before, but never with this kind of hostility or fear. The officer's words echoed in his mind, "You don't belong here." They weren't just words, they were a challenge, an accusation. But they weren't the worst part. The worst part was the fear he saw in the officer's eyes. He couldn't ignore that. Marcus reached his apartment and parked the SUV in the lot. As he sat in the car, his hand gripping the steering wheel, he felt a deep sense of frustration building in his chest. He wanted to forget it. He wanted to go inside, take a shower, and get some sleep. But he couldn't. Not after what had happened. The voice. The officer. Something wasn't right, and Marcus was determined to figure it out. He grabbed his phone, but before he could dial, his screen lit up with a notification. It was a message from his partner, Officer Taylor Brooks, sent just minutes earlier. "Marcus, you there? Need to talk. Something's off about tonight." His heart skipped a beat. Taylor. Of all people, he trusted Taylor the most. They had been through so much together, squad car chases, undercover operations, and dealing with the worst criminals the city had to offer. But there was something about the tone of the message that made Marcus feel even more uneasy. It wasn't just a check-in, it was urgent. And the way Taylor had worded it made it sound like something had gone horribly wrong. Marcus quickly typed a reply, "I'm here. What's going on?" Within seconds, the phone buzzed again with a reply. "Meet me at the diner on 7th. It's important." Marcus didn't waste another second. He grabbed his jacket and locked the car, heading straight for the diner. The diner on 7th Street was one of those places that never seemed to change. The neon sign flickered in the dark, and the smell of fried food and coffee hung in the air. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was a staple of the city, a quiet refuge for anyone looking for a meal or a place to think. When Marcus entered, his eyes immediately found Taylor sitting in the back booth. The younger officer looked stressed, his shoulders hunched as he stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. When he saw Marcus, his expression shifted from anxious to relieved. "You're here," Taylor said, standing up and gesturing for Marcus to sit. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." "What's going on, Taylor?" Marcus asked, sliding into the booth across from his partner. "What's this about?" Taylor leaned in, his voice low. "I don't know how to say this, but I think you're in danger. And it's not just some random thing. I think you were targeted." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his pulse quickening. "Targeted? By who?" Taylor glanced around the diner, his eyes scanning the room as though checking for eavesdroppers. "It's not just one person, Marcus. It's bigger than that. I found something, and I think the officer who pulled you over tonight is part of it." Marcus's mind began to race. "What are you talking about?" Taylor took a deep breath and slid a small folder across the table. It was thick, the kind of folder that contained evidence, papers, reports, maybe something more. I've been investigating some strange activity within the department. At first, I thought it was just rumors, but the more I looked into it, the more I realized there was something to it. Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. It was a list of names, dates, and locations. There were reports of officers who had been involved in questionable behavior, racial profiling, intimidation, and worse. But there was one name that stood out to Marcus, Officer Ryan Mitchell. The same officer who had pulled him over just hours ago. Mitchell's been on this list for months, Taylor said, his voice tight. But I never thought he'd be involved in something like this. He's been acting strange lately, more aggressive, more confrontational. I've heard whispers about him, but no one would talk. Everyone's too afraid to say anything. Marcus's mind was spinning. What exactly do you think he's involved in? Taylor shook his head. I'm not sure, but it's bad. It's a network of cops who have been, well, let's just say they've been involved in things that are illegal, unethical, and downright dangerous. Mitchell's a part of it. And I think he's been watching you. Why me? Marcus asked, still trying to piece it all together. What could he possibly have against me? Taylor hesitated before answering. Because you're in charge. You're the captain. You're the one who has the power to stop them. Marcus's stomach churned. He had been a cop for too long to not recognize when something was seriously wrong. He had heard rumors about corruption in the department before, but he never imagined it could be this widespread, this dangerous. He had always prided himself on being above the politics of the force, but now it seemed the politics had come for him. I need to confront Mitchell, Marcus said, standing up and slamming the folder shut. I'm not letting this slide. Taylor grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the booth. You can't just confront him like that. If you do, you'll be walking right into their trap. They've been planning something, and I don't think it's just about you. It's bigger than that, Marcus. Marcus shook his head. I don't care about their trap. I care about stopping this. I'm not going to sit by while innocent people get hurt. Taylor looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and respect. I know. But we need to be smart about this. You can't go in there alone. Marcus paused. Then what do you suggest we do? Taylor reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. I've been gathering information on these guys. I have a contact who's been sending me everything they've been up to. If we can get this to the right people, we can take them down. Marcus took the flash drive and pocketed it. All right. Let's do this. The two of them spent the next hour in the diner, strategizing their next move. Marcus knew it wasn't going to be easy. The department was full of people he had worked with for years, people he had trusted. The thought that some of them could be involved in this sick network made his skin crawl. But if what Taylor said was true, then this wasn't just about corruption. This was about a group of officers who had crossed a line. A line that no one in law enforcement should ever cross. As they left the diner, Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Officer Mitchell. I don't think you understand. You don't belong here. Not in this city. Not in this department. Marcus's blood ran cold. The words were a warning, but Marcus didn't know if they were meant for him, or if they were meant to make him back down. But he wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Marcus sat in his car, staring at the flashing lights of the police department building in front of him. The city was asleep, but he wasn't. His mind was on overdrive, piecing together the fragments of information Taylor had given him. Officer Ryan Mitchell's cryptic message only made things worse. You don't belong here. What did that mean? Was it a threat? A warning? Or was Mitchell just playing some mind game? No. Marcus knew better than to second-guess his instincts. It wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. The kind of invitation you get when someone is ready to eliminate you as a threat. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He had spent his career fighting corruption, fighting injustice in the system. But this was different. This wasn't just about a bad cop or a few rogue officers. This was something bigger. Something deeper. The flash drive Taylor had given him sat in the passenger seat, a small, unassuming piece of plastic that held the potential to unravel everything. If Taylor was right, if the information on that drive could expose the hidden network of corrupt officers, it could bring the whole department crashing down. It could change everything. But Marcus couldn't help but wonder if he was getting in too deep. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it became. And yet, he couldn't back down now. Not when he had come this far. He checked his phone again. No new messages. It had been hours since the last one from Mitchell. Marcus thought about heading home, getting some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Not with the weight of what he was carrying. Finally, he made his decision. He couldn't wait any longer. It was time to confront Mitchell. But this time, he wouldn't be alone. He needed backup, someone he could trust. Marcus pulled out of the parking lot and headed to Taylor's apartment. It was just a short drive, but the weight of what was about to happen hung in the air. It felt like the calm before the storm. When he arrived, Taylor was already waiting outside, his face tense. He didn't say anything as Marcus got out of the car, just gave him a nod. There was no need for words. They both knew what they were walking into. "Are you sure about this?" Taylor asked, his voice low. Marcus glanced at him, his face hardening. "I don't have a choice. Mitchell has to be stopped." Taylor hesitated before nodding. "All right. Let's do this." The two of them didn't waste any more time. They headed toward Mitchell's last known address, a rundown building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the kind of place a cop like Mitchell should be living in. Marcus had expected something more reputable. But then again, the people at the top didn't always stay at the top without making a few enemies along the way. As they approached the building, Marcus noticed the lack of any real security. There were no guards, no cameras, just a crumbling structure that looked like it hadn't seen any care in years. It felt wrong, almost like it was a place where secrets were buried. And that made Marcus even more uneasy. "Stay close," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We go in, get the info, and get out. Fast." Taylor nodded, and they made their way toward the entrance. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dark hallway. It smelled musty, old, stale air, the kind that made you wonder what had been kept hidden for so long. They moved quickly, keeping their footsteps light, their eyes scanning every shadow. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but there was no one in sight. Just the oppressive silence of the place. Finally, they reached Mitchell's door. Marcus didn't hesitate. He knocked once, firmly. There was a pause before the sound of shuffling from inside. A voice called out, low and gravelly. "Who's there?" "Marcus," he said, his voice steady. "Open up." The door swung open just a crack. Mitchell's face appeared, a mix of surprise and suspicion. "What do you want?" "We need to talk," Marcus said, keeping his tone calm. "We know what's going on, Mitchell. It's time to end this." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. He glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was around. "You don't know what you're messing with." Marcus took a step forward. "I think I do." Without warning, Mitchell pulled the door open wider, revealing a dark, cluttered apartment. It was clear that Mitchell hadn't bothered with the usual comforts. The place was bare, save for a few pieces of furniture and piles of documents scattered around. The air was thick with the smell of cheap cigarettes and stale beer. Marcus and Taylor stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. Mitchell didn't make a move to stop them, but his tense posture told Marcus everything he needed to know. Mitchell knew the situation was bad, but he wasn't ready to go down without a fight. "You think you've got all the answers?" Mitchell asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "You have no idea what's really going on." "We know enough," Marcus said, his gaze locking with Mitchell's. "This isn't just about you or me. This is about everything. The corruption, the lies, the cover-ups. It's all connected." Mitchell let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple? You think this is just about a few bad apples? You've got no clue what you're up against." Taylor stepped forward. "What does that mean? Who's behind all this?" Mitchell's eyes darted nervously. He wasn't going to talk. Marcus could see it in his eyes, the fear, the desperation. But Marcus wasn't about to back down. "Listen to me," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I don't care how deep this goes. I don't care who's involved. I'm taking you down, Mitchell. You can't hide behind your badge anymore." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, finally, Mitchell spoke, his voice shaky but determined. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You're too late. They're already watching you. They've been watching you. This was never about just one officer. This was about making sure no one stood in their way." Marcus's stomach tightened. Who's behind this?" But Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, he reached for something on the counter, a small, unmarked envelope, and tossed it onto the table. "Open it," Mitchell said. "And you'll understand." Marcus glanced at Taylor, who nodded. Carefully, Marcus tore open the envelope. Inside, there was a single piece of paper, covered in handwritten notes. It was a list of names, officers, politicians, and other high-ranking figures. But there was something else, a map, marked with locations all over the city. It was a blueprint, a detailed plan. "This is bigger than I thought," Marcus whispered. Mitchell's face twisted in anger. "You don't understand, do you? There's no stopping it now. They've already made their move. All of you, every last one of you, are just pawns in their game." Before Marcus could respond, there was a loud crash from the hallway, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Someone was coming. "Get down!" Marcus shouted, pulling Taylor to the floor. The door burst open, and men in black tactical gear stormed into the room, weapons drawn. Marcus and Taylor barely had time to react before they were both pinned to the ground. "We told you to stay out of it," one of the men said, his voice cold and robotic. The harsh metallic clang of handcuffs snapped Marcus back to reality. His wrists ached as the cold steel bit into his skin. He had no idea who these men were, but they were serious. The tactical gear and weaponry were a dead giveaway, they weren't local law enforcement. No, this was something deeper. Something darker. Taylor lay beside him, just as motionless, his eyes darting around the room. The two of them had been caught off guard, but Marcus wasn't one to give up so easily. He had been in tight situations before, and he'd always found a way out. He wasn't about to let a group of shadowy figures drag him into some dark conspiracy without a fight. One of the men stepped forward. He was tall, with a scar running down his face, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the dim lighting. "Don't try anything funny," the man said, his voice deep and menacing. "You won't get far." Marcus stayed silent, assessing the situation. There were 3 others in the room, all with weapons trained on him and Taylor. Whoever these people were, they weren't here for a friendly chat. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. "What do you want with us?" The scarred man didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Marcus, as if trying to size him up. Finally, he spoke, his voice colder now. "You've been poking around where you don't belong. You've stirred up something that should have stayed buried." Marcus glanced at the map on the table. The locations, the names, it was clear now. They were all connected, tied together by something far more insidious than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just about corruption in the police force. This was something bigger, something that reached into every corner of the city, possibly even the country. "What's this about?" Marcus asked again, his voice sharper. "Why are you going after me and Taylor?" The man finally cracked a smile, though it was anything but friendly. "You're just another inconvenience. But you've been asking the right questions, and that makes you dangerous." Taylor shifted beside Marcus, but he didn't speak. He was taking it all in, just like Marcus. Both of them were thinking the same thing: they had to get out of here. And fast. One of the other men stepped forward and pulled out a phone. "We've got company," he said, his voice low but urgent. The scarred man nodded, his expression darkening. Marcus didn't like the sound of that. They were on a timer. They needed to move before reinforcements arrived. Without warning, the scarred man motioned to the others. "Take them out of here. Now." Before Marcus could react, one of the men yanked him to his feet, dragging him toward the door. Taylor was in no better condition. One of the other men was holding him by the arm, pushing him forward. "What do you want from us?" Marcus demanded, struggling against the grip. "What's this all about?" The scarred man didn't respond. He just watched as Marcus and Taylor were forced down the hallway and out the door. The cold air hit Marcus's face as they were shoved into a black SUV parked outside. The vehicle roared to life, and they were off, speeding through the city. Marcus tried to get his bearings, to figure out where they were going, but it was hard to tell. The streets blurred in the night, the city lights flickering in and out of view. They were heading deeper into unfamiliar territory, a part of the city Marcus had never ventured into. It felt like they were entering the heart of the storm. After what seemed like an eternity, the SUV finally came to a stop. The doors were flung open, and Marcus and Taylor were pulled out roughly, shoved into a dark building. The interior was stark, cold concrete floors, industrial lighting overhead. There was nothing about it that screamed safe. They were pushed into a small, dimly lit room, the door slamming shut behind them. There were no windows, no furniture. Just a concrete slab in the center of the room, a light bulb hanging above it, casting harsh shadows on the walls. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence hung heavily in the air. "What now?" Taylor asked, his voice hoarse. "We wait," Marcus replied, his mind racing. He needed to think, to figure out what their next move was. But everything had happened so fast. One moment, they were investigating the corruption, and the next, they were being dragged into some underground operation with no idea who was behind it. Marcus didn't trust these people, but he needed information. He needed to know why they were here, why they were after him, and, most importantly, how they were connected to everything. "I don't get it," Taylor said, breaking the silence. "Who are these people? They don't look like regular cops." Marcus exhaled slowly. "They're not. Whoever they are, they're playing a bigger game. Something we don't fully understand yet." Taylor frowned. "You think Mitchell was working with them?" Marcus nodded. "It's possible. He seemed terrified when he handed me that envelope. He knew we were walking into something dangerous." "But why?" Taylor pressed. "Why would he give you that map? He could have just killed us." "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Marcus muttered. "But it doesn't make sense. Mitchell had to have been part of something bigger, something he couldn't control." Suddenly, the door opened. The scarred man entered, flanked by two others. He didn't look at Marcus or Taylor as he walked to the center of the room and took a seat at a metal table. "You've been asking questions," the scarred man said, his tone colder now. "You should have known better than to dig into things that aren't meant to be found. Who are you?" Marcus asked again, his patience wearing thin. The man smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone just before the truth breaks them. "We're the ones who keep the city running," he said. "We're the ones who make sure the gears keep turning. Without us, everything falls apart." Marcus clenched his fists. "You're the ones behind all this. The corruption, the cover-ups, the lies." "More than that," the scarred man replied. "We're the ones who control everything. The cops, the politicians, the media. We make sure nothing threatens the balance." Marcus couldn't believe it. These men weren't just a rogue faction, they were the puppet masters, pulling the strings behind the scenes. "How many of you are there?" Taylor asked, his voice shaky. The scarred man leaned forward, his face inches from Marcus's. "Enough to make sure you and your friend never leave this place. You should have stayed out of it." "I don't think so," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "I'm not going anywhere." The scarred man chuckled darkly. "You don't have a choice. You and your friend are in way too deep. There's no getting out now." Marcus's mind was racing. They needed a plan. They needed to escape, to take this fight back to the surface where it belonged. Before Marcus could think of a way out, the door opened again, and a figure stepped inside. This person was different, calm, collected. He was older than the others, with a sharp suit and a face that could pass for anyone in a position of power. "Let them go," the man said, his voice smooth but authoritative. The scarred man stood up quickly, almost as if he were afraid of this new arrival. "Sir, they're a threat." "I said, let them go," the man repeated. His voice brooked no argument. The scarred man stepped back, his face tense but obedient. He gave Marcus and Taylor one last look, then nodded to his men. Without a word, they unlocked the handcuffs and stepped aside. "You're free to go," the older man said, motioning toward the door. Marcus didn't move at first. He was confused. What was going on? Who was this man, and why was he letting them go? "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice low. The man's lips curled into a tight smile. "Because you're not the real threat. Not yet, anyway." Marcus didn't wait for more. He grabbed Taylor's arm and pulled him toward the door. They were out of the room in seconds, but they had no idea what they were walking into next. One thing was clear, this wasn't over. It had only just begun. Marcus and Taylor walked out of the room, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Their footsteps echoed down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air felt thick, like something was watching them, waiting. But there was no turning back now. They had made it out of that hellish room, but the real danger was just beginning. They didn't know who to trust anymore, not even the man who had let them go. Was he a friend, or another player in the game? "We can't just leave," Marcus muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something bigger going on here. Something we're missing." Taylor, still shaken from the encounter, nodded. "I know. But what do we do now? We don't have any leads, no way of knowing what's really happening." Marcus's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The map, Mitchell's warning, the people who'd taken them, it was all connected, but the threads were tangled in a way that made it hard to see the whole picture. What was the real story behind the corruption in the police force? Why had Mitchell been so terrified? And who was the older man who'd just let them go? As they reached the end of the hallway, Marcus paused. A small security camera overhead blinked red. He glanced at Taylor, who looked equally uncertain. Neither of them knew where this path would lead, but they couldn't stop now. They needed answers. And no matter how dangerous it was, they had to get them. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, his voice tight. "We don't know what's ahead." They turned a corner and came face to face with a heavy steel door. It was locked, but there was a keypad beside it. Marcus reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his phone. He hadn't thought about the device in hours, but now it seemed like the perfect tool. He fumbled with it for a second before swiping the screen. There was a number saved in his contacts. It was an old number, one he hadn't used in years. He hesitated before dialing. 3 days earlier. A sharp knock on the door interrupted Marcus's focus. He had been deep in thought, trying to figure out what had happened with Mitchell and the strange envelope. The events from earlier that morning were still fresh in his mind, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right. Marcus had seen corruption before, but this? This was something different. Something more dangerous. And he had to get to the bottom of it. He opened the door to find Taylor standing there, his face set in determination. Without saying a word, Taylor walked past him, his eyes scanning the apartment for anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't unusual for Taylor to show up unannounced, but today felt different. "I think we need to talk," Taylor said, his voice lower than usual. Marcus closed the door behind them, his eyes narrowing. "About what?" Taylor paused before answering. "Mitchell." Marcus stiffened at the mention of the name. "What about him?" "I don't trust him," Taylor said bluntly. "And after today? I don't think we can trust anyone who's been involved with him." Marcus's heart raced. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Mitchell is in deep." "Deeper than we thought," Taylor replied. "He's not just some low-level officer. I think he's been working with the people we're trying to expose." The thought hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Mitchell, the man who had been their ally, their source, he was involved in the very conspiracy they were trying to unravel? "No," Marcus said, shaking his head. "That doesn't make sense." "He was scared when he handed me that envelope. I saw it in his eyes. Whatever he's involved in, he's not the mastermind." Taylor didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer to Marcus, his face serious. "You don't get it, Marcus. You're thinking too small. Mitchell may be scared, but he's still part of something much bigger. Something more powerful than we realize." Marcus's mind spun as Taylor's words sank in. The implications were staggering. Was Mitchell just a pawn in a game that was beyond him? Or had he been playing both sides all along? Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then cursed under his breath. It was a message from an unknown number. He opened it quickly. "They're watching. Be careful. Trust no one." The message sent a chill through his body. Marcus looked up at Taylor. "We need to move. Now. Back to the present." Marcus stared at the message on his phone, trying to make sense of it. Was the person who sent it the same person who had helped them escape earlier? The older man? Was he a whistleblower, or was he playing a dangerous game of his own? The keypad by the door beeped, and the lock clicked open. Marcus pushed the door slightly, then peeked inside. The room beyond was dark, but he could make out the silhouette of a desk and several large filing cabinets. There was something familiar about the space, but he couldn't quite place it. "Let's go," Marcus whispered to Taylor. They stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The office was colder than the rest of the building. Marcus's eyes adjusted to the dim light as he scanned the room. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until he noticed a file sitting on the desk. It was thick, but what stood out to him was the symbol on the cover. It was the same symbol he had seen on the map, the one that linked the corruption to the police force. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "This is what we've been looking for." He reached for the file, but as his hand touched the edge, he heard footsteps approaching. Quick, urgent footsteps. Without thinking, Marcus yanked the file off the desk and shoved it into his bag. He glanced at Taylor, who was already moving toward the back door. "We need to go now," Marcus hissed. They bolted toward the door, but as Marcus twisted the handle, he froze. The door was locked. He turned to look at Taylor, who was already pulling out his phone. "No signal," Taylor muttered, cursing under his breath. "We're trapped." Just as Marcus was about to panic, the door flew open. A figure stood there, tall, menacing, and familiar. The scarred man. "Thought you could just walk away, huh?" he said, his voice low and threatening. The scarred man stood in the doorway, his presence overwhelming. Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle heavily in his chest. Taylor was already edging toward the back of the room, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Marcus could feel the pulse in his neck, his heart racing as the tension in the air thickened. The man in the doorway wasn't here by coincidence, he was here for them. "Did you really think you could get away?" the scarred man asked, his voice steady, but laced with menace. His eyes flickered briefly to the file Marcus had shoved into his bag before locking onto him. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Marcus gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a plan. There was no way out. The file was their only hope, the key to understanding everything, the corruption, the conspiracy, the people pulling the strings. Without it, they were as good as dead. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, his voice betraying none of his fear. "But you don't have to do this. Let us go." The scarred man smiled darkly, stepping into the room, blocking the only exit. His movements were deliberate, calculated. He was in control, and he knew it. "You think I'm the one who's in charge?" the scarred man chuckled, walking further into the room. "You've got it all wrong, Marcus. You've been chasing ghosts. This is just the beginning." Marcus felt his blood run cold. He had suspected that things were deeper than they seemed, but this was worse than anything he had imagined. What was this man talking about? Who was pulling the strings behind all of this? Taylor took a step forward, trying to position himself between Marcus and the scarred man. "If you're going to kill us, just do it," he spat, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "But know this, we'll bring you down. One way or another." The scarred man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Oh, you'll bring me down?" He laughed, and the sound was like ice scraping across metal. "You've been running in circles. What makes you think you're the ones who get to decide how this ends?" Marcus's mind was a blur. They were caught in a game they didn't fully understand. The people they were up against were ruthless, calculating. He could feel the weight of their enemy's power pressing in on him. "What do you want from us?" Marcus demanded, his voice strained. He was done with the games. He needed answers. The scarred man cocked his head, considering. "What I want," he said slowly, "is simple. I want you to understand the truth." Marcus's stomach churned. The truth. They had been seeking it for so long, but now it felt like it might shatter everything they knew. "This system," the scarred man continued, his voice lowering to a whisper, "it's not what you think. The people you've been chasing, the corrupt officers, the ones who've betrayed their own, they're just pawns. You think you're going after the root of the problem, but you're not. You're just scratching the surface." Marcus blinked, trying to process what the man was saying. "What do you mean?" "The real power isn't in the hands of the police force," the scarred man said, his eyes glinting with an eerie light. "It never was. It's in the hands of the ones who control everything. The ones you'll never see coming." Marcus felt a sharp jolt of realization. "The people behind the scenes," he murmured. The scarred man nodded. "Exactly. You've been going after the wrong targets. The people you've been chasing are just distractions. The real power lies with those who pull the strings from the shadows." Taylor stepped forward, his voice tense. "So, what now? You just expect us to roll over and play along with your game? The scarred man's eyes hardened. You're too late. The plan is already in motion. There's no stopping it now. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He had no idea what this man was talking about, but it was clear that whatever was happening was far beyond anything they had anticipated. They had thought they were uncovering corruption, but this? This was something bigger, something that could change everything. The scarred man took a step closer, his voice low. You've already seen too much. It doesn't matter if you're still alive. You're already part of the plan. And there's no way out. Then what do you want from us? Marcus pressed, his voice desperate. Why not just kill us and be done with it? The scarred man's gaze flickered to the file Marcus had taken. That file is the key, he said. But it's not enough. You don't understand what's inside. It's not the answers you think it is. It's something far worse. Marcus's stomach twisted. They had thought the file would give them everything they needed. The evidence, the truth. But it seemed like they were still missing something, something crucial. What are you talking about? Taylor demanded, his voice sharp. You're telling us that after all this, it's all for nothing? The scarred man's lips curled into a cruel smile. You still don't get it. This is bigger than you. Bigger than anything you could ever imagine. The real players have already won. All you're doing is chasing shadows. Marcus clenched his fists. So, what happens now? The scarred man's smile faded, and his expression grew serious. Now, you have two choices. You can walk away and pretend none of this ever happened, or you can keep fighting. But know this, if you keep going, you'll never be safe. Not from them. Not from anyone. Marcus didn't hesitate. We're not walking away. The scarred man's expression hardened, and he stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Then you're already dead. It's just a matter of time. As they walked past him, the tension in the air was suffocating. But they had made their choice. They would not stop until they found the truth. Even if it meant risking everything.